Storytime. What I did when running a false Hydra in Werewolf the Apocalypse, which is part of the World of Darkness, it's not D&D. So the player I was running for, it's a one-on-one game, had no idea that I was doing this because a false Hydra, as far as I'm aware, is a homebrew D&D monster that very few people will ever think to include outside of D&D. Therefore, I opted to throw it in a game of Werewolf. What I did before the game began, I made a list of all of the packs within the Sept that the player's character was going to join. And I wrote up all of the characters in them. This is a very Sept-focused game. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of relationship building, community. And I wrote down which ones died months in advance. I was sitting on names, auspices, tribes for some of them. Some of them I didn't have and I just knew that they had died. But I had notes about characters that were going to die that had not died yet. So that throughout the entire time period of playing the game, I could drop hints that there was more going on that my player picked up on, thought was weird, and questioned me about, that I brushed off as either plot holes or I justified it with other characters doing stuff. For instance, going to a moot, the player's character was like, I'm going to bring some food. So the pack of the player character had two members, Weeps and Breaker. But months from now, real world time, Weeps was going to die by a false Hydra. As far as my player knew, it was just a two-person pack of their character and Breaker. Breaker says, okay, I can bring cups and I can bring plates. And Silverpaw was the name of the player character, went, okay, Pog. Silverpaw picks up Breaker. Breaker only has cups. Silverpaw goes, bro, why didn't you grab plates? You said you were going to grab plates. And Breaker goes, I never said I was going to bring plates. What are you talking about? I said I was going to bring cups. The player asked me, didn't he say he was going to bring cups and plates? And I was like, yeah, he did. He's a kid. He's a couple years younger than you. What do you expect? Luckily, you do have some plates in your backseat, right? From some shopping trip you had that you just never took the car. And my player was like, oh, awesome. Similarly, Breaker is a kid. He's like 18. He's a high schooler. He doesn't know what's going on. So they're going on a walk in the woods. They're talking to this tree spirit and they're trying to understand how to communicate with it. Because whenever they ask it a question, it will like drop one leaf or a single acorn will fall and roll to their feet. And they're like, how do we communicate with this? And then the kid is just like, what if it's kind of like Boba Kiki? And then the player's like, oh, wait, that makes sense. Like, because it dropped a stick, which is like kind of Kiki, and it dropped a leaf, which is kind of like Boba. Is like Boba good? So like maybe the more lush the thing dropped is, the better the response, the more positive it is. And then they kind of like puzzled it through. But that wasn't Breaker. That was Weeps that suggested it because Weeps is a psychology major in college. So Weeps understands stuff like Boba Kiki. And then the player is just like, hey, Breaker, do you know about Boba Kiki? And Breaker's like, the heck is Boba Kiki? Silverpaw is just like, what are you talking about, bro? You're the one that brought this up. So it's these constant plot holes, mixed memories, thinking one character did something when another one actually did it. For months, I was doing this like once a session. And then eventually they find the false Hydra. They all die. But because it's a false Hydra and their memories are gone, they're investigating this area where the false Hydra is. And they're all like, huh, this is weird. There's nothing here. There was some massive spiritual disturbance, but this is just an empty clearing. And then suddenly Breaker, member of the pack, is just like, hey, I feel like we should return back to our cairn. I have a sudden instinct to run back to the cairn. I'm going to go back to the cairn. And he sprints. And then Silverpaw is just like, yeah, we really shouldn't leave it unguarded. Let's go, guys. And runs off. And when they get back to the cairn, two of them were guarding the Sept. And when they arrive, they look at Silverpaw and go, oh my God, what happened? And Silverpaw's like, what? And it turns out that Silverpaw had a giant chunk of his torso bitten into by teeth that were the size of his head. Breaker, the kid, was actively bleeding. His leg was broken. He collapses on the floor. Everyone in the Sept is like nearly dead because they fought the false Hydra. They didn't realize they were fighting it because they forgot later, and they lost, so they had to retreat. And during the retreat, half of the Sept got eaten. And this is where I unveiled my masterstroke, because at their cairn, at the central meeting point where all of the sept meets, a tradition I established immediately is that hanging from the trees are these little like strings, or sorry, these little strings, each corresponding to a pack. So for instance, the pack, the second rates, will have all of the members of the second rates take a rock, write their name, their auspice, and their tribe, which is like Garrow werewolf stuff, and tie it to one of these strings. The leftmost one is if you're alive. The middle one is if you're in chagrin, basically like you're ashamed. You have to redeem yourself to get out of chagrin. And the rightmost one is that you died. When they return, they are tending to their wounds. They're like, what happened? Why are we so beat up? They look around and they realize every single pack has one extra bead in the alive category. One extra stone hangs from the string indicating someone is alive because every single pack had someone eaten by the false hydra that for months of real world time, I actively took actions for. For instance, and this is where like I broke it down to the player because the player's like, wait, what the heck? What's going on? And then they picked up on it very quickly once they saw all the stones and whatever. And I started giving examples. I brought up Boba Kiki. I brought up the plates and the cup conversation. I brought up how one time they were fighting a Bane, and in the middle of the fight of the Bane, a tree just fell down on it. And when I said, isn't it weird that a tree just fell down on that Bane during that fight from a while ago? The player went, oh my God, I forgot about that. This may have been the single best thing I have ever done as a GM, full stop. This took months of setup and setup and setup. Little things like when there was a transition of power, Balanced Tongue is chosen as the new leader of the Sept. And she takes Friend of Smoke, who is a member of our pack, and says, hey, I want you to be my second. I want you to be the person to officiate my rising to the rank of the leader of our Sept. And Friend of Smoke goes, why not the old man? And the player hearing this, because the player's obviously present for the new leader of the Sept's like coronation, basically. It's like, old man? We don't have an old man in the Sept. And I'm like, no, you don't. And then I moved on and I did not address it. And I did not bring it up again because one of the people who died from the Wailing One was significantly older than everyone. In fact, founded the Sept years ago. And they were with Keeper of Cairns, Flame Tongue, Barkskin. There's a tree that had the names of the founders carved into it. There was Keeper of Cairns, but also there was only two founders. There was only ever two founders. So it was Flame Tongue Barkskin, despite the fact that clearly line 1, line 2, line 3. And when the player asked about this, it's like, wait, Barkskin, like, isn't that like a third line? They're like, oh yeah, I guess like Flame Tongue Barkskin just ran out of room to write their name. So they just like added another line. But Barkskin the entire time had survived, was advising the Sept, introduced and brought Silverpaw, the player character's Garrow, into the Sept, proceeded over their initiation, and then died, and the player never met them because the character forgot. There's other things like it is the pack plus an SPC, right? So there's this SPC Orion, there's Paw, there's Breaker, and there's Weeps. But Weeps doesn't exist because what Weeps does happened, but Paw always just assumes it was Breaker. And so I always describe it as Breaker doing it. So Paw, Breaker, and Orion, plus Weeps, ignore Weeps, go over, they go to a cave and there's a dead body in it and 3 individuals approach it. And then the body stands back up because it's a vampire. And then the 4 individuals walk away. This happened like before Paw, Breaker, and Orion got to the cave. So they ask a local spirit, like, hey, what did you see? And the spirit says, there were 3 individuals, they entered, there's a dead body, the dead body stood up, and then they equaled you in number. The player is just like, wait, they equaled us in number? But there's only 3 of us and there's 4 of them. And then the spirit just kept talking. The spirit ignored it because the spirit was counting Weeps because the spirit hadn't forgotten Weeps at that point, so would have addressed them as 4 instead of as 3. And the player knew that there was only 3 of them. And because it was 3 plus a corpse, they assumed, oh, the spirit's just talking about the 3 alive people, not the vampire. They did all of the gaslighting themselves. I didn't even have to gaslight them. They did it to themselves. Gotta say, these names give such warrior cat feels. Listen, I never read Warrior Cats. This is my Warrior Cats. False Hydras seem so hard to run. So False Hydras are not hard to run unless you do it the way I did. The way I did it was some of the most fun, and it was some of the most rewarding gameplay I think I've ever had as a GM, bar none. However, if you want to do the classic, you enter into a town. Oh, the blacksmith is empty. Where's the blacksmith? Oh, we don't have a blacksmith. Then why do you have a blacksmith shop? Because that's where the blacksmith works. Oh, then where's the blacksmith? We don't have a blacksmith. That's fun in its own regard. That's how most people run a False Hydra. And that's how most people will pick up on the fact there's a False Hydra. I basically saw that and said, I can do better. And maybe it's the ego in me. Maybe it is the sheer nonsensical ability of me to just throw myself at a problem to see what happens. It stuck. And one of the best part in Werewolf, you have different stories within a larger chronicle. A chronicle is like your campaign. That's with all the characters and story arcs and whatever. A story is like a season in a TV show. I was so patient. I held my breath. I waited until halfway through story 2. Story 1 was all about, hey, where's the leader of the Sept, introducing Daguerreau life, going on your first adventure, like all of the intro stuff. I didn't do anything False Hydra. There was no, oh, people are going missing. There was no, your memory feels fuzzy. It was entirely unrelated. And you want to know what? When we finished story 1, my roommate was like, okay, I think I want to like run vampire for you now. And I'm like, you sure you don't want to play just a little bit more werewolf? And then they're like, no, I want to run for you. And then I was like, I was a hair's breadth from putting in all of the work and setup and having it just not go anywhere. And I would have had to keep my mouth shut to not spoil for my roommate who I had already put all the work into. But luckily we ended up doing a back and forth, like where we run at the same time. So then I run through story 2, and then story 2 was entirely about the Wailing One. And even still, I start story 2. Nothing is wrong. There's no disappearances. There's no mishaps. In fact, there's a whole other plot line going on. I started a new plot line in story 2, unrelated to the Wailing One, to the False Hydra, because I knew that if I just went balls to the wall right off the bat, if I bust my load early, that would not be satisfying. I was so patient. You didn't do better. You were obliterated the original concept. No. So that's the thing. Arrow looked at the villagers forget everything and went skill issue, failure of imagination, to paraphrase. I stand on the shoulders of giants. I would not have even considered that idea had I not heard about a False Hydra. And the False Hydra, not just the original concept, but other people's stories of a False Hydra. I would not have run it the way I did had I not had influence from Kane. I kind of ran it a little bit like a Kane hunt. Not entirely, but a little bit. As awesome as that was, as much as I think that legitimately is probably the most impressive thing I've ever done as a GM. It's not special. It's not unique. It is not something that you can't do. You just need to have the confidence, the delusion, and the commitment to see through. I did that fully knowing, listen, if this stops after story 1, this was all a waste. If I overplay my hand and I focus too much on the missing people, I ruin it. But if I don't give any hints, it's gonna feel cheap. So I need to strike a balance. And the way I did that is I focused on other stuff almost entirely. I focused on other plot lines. The entirety of story 1 was getting to know the Sept, getting to be acquainted with Garrow society, getting to understand how being a Garrow is. The leader of the Sept had succumbed to Hirano, was no longer a valid leader, was missing, and everyone was looking for her. And then story 1 ended with her leaving, very sadly. Story 2 opened with kindred vampires trying to mess with the Garrow in their own ways. And then turns out for the Wailing One, for the False Hydra, because they were in the pocket and colluding with Black Spiral dancers. I'm not going to get into what that means here, but if you know, you know. And that has been guiding story 3. Even though very firmly the False Hydra is enmeshed in how I ran the game. It was never the A plot until like halfway through story 2, and then it ended at the end of story 2. The A plot was always, how are we going to get the Sept to work together? How are we going to pursue the spirit nonsense? How are we going to deal with shattered leadership? How are we going to deal with the kindred? This is definitely the most insane way to run a false Hydra, but man, it's impressive. I wish I had a DM as dedicated as you. It's not that impressive. It is something that you or your DM can do. It is something that I encourage you to attempt. The one thing I will say is this. I went into the game knowing I was going to do this. I went into the game planning for this. And before the game started, I asked my player very directly. I said, in the context of the game, are you comfortable if I unironically gaslight you? I'm not joking. I'm not saying like, oh, haha, like I'm pulling you like, no, like I actually make you question the reality of the game. And they said, as long as it stays within the confines of the game, sure. And I said, okay, let me know if you ever get uncomfortable. I made sure to check with my players' comfort and boundaries before I even attempted something like this. Because for instance, if you are playing with someone who is schizoaffective, maybe you shouldn't do that because that might worsen already existing struggles that they already deal with. Communication is everything, up to and including malignant communication. In a game, you can have hostile communication. You can have pushing of boundaries in an acceptable and safe and comfortable manner, but you have to discuss that first.